Every is and has evolved to be the one subscription we think you need to stay at the edge of AI. And it's ideas, content, which is what I run, apps, which are the productivity and other apps that we manage, and then trainings, which is consulting and courses.
In this episode of The Narrative, I spoke with Kate Lee. Kate and I have known each other for a while now, and she's a true veteran in the tech storytelling space. She started in trad publishing as a literary agent before moving into tech and has helped shape narrative strategy at companies like WeWork, Medium, and Stripe Press, where she was head of publishing. Today, Kate is the editor-in-chief at Every, where they're blending long-form editorial content with a portfolio of software bets.
Going forward into 2026, broadly speaking, what the every strategy is to like how to sort of knit together this ecosystem. So, we have the ideas, we have the apps, we have the training. Like, how do we make them all feel like part of the same universe? And so I think that's what a lot of the work will be in 2026.
This conversation focuses on Kate's backstory and what it actually takes to build taste and trust over time. Okay, here's Kate. All right, cool. Kate, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
I'm actually very curious to start um, when you were a literary agent, like at your time as a literary agent. I think that's kind of interesting. We're going to talk about tech quite a bit, but I do want to talk about that and ask you how that informs your approach today, if it does inform your approach today to editorial.
Sure. So I started out as a literary agent, or at least I started out as an assistant to a literary agent, not necessarily knowing that that's what I would become. But I basically, literary agents represent writers and sell their books, their book deals, and quickly realized that the way to succeed as an agent and to get promoted in the particular agency that I was in was not just being great at answering phones and being a great assistant, but it was really about actually developing my own taste and my own list and going after my own clients. And that wasn't necessarily easy to do because you also still had to work on, for someone else who was an extremely busy, successful boss. But you basically had to kind of find your niche. And I worked among people who are among the best in the business at what they do, and they represent Pulitzer Prize winners and, you know, heads of government and major New York Times bestsellers and literary, commercial, all sorts of just amazing, amazing talent. And so as a young person, I was like, well, how am where do I find that? I can't compete with the Pulitzer Prize winners and all the rest. And, this was a little over 20 years ago now. What was happening was people writing online. It was the first iteration of bloggers. And those were people who I saw were finding an audience. And so I kind of just naturally gravitated to them. A lot of them happen to live in New York, which is where I live. It was a pretty small and self-contained world at that time. And I just was attracted to them because they seemed to have a voice and a style. And it's not that I necessarily knew exactly what to do with it, but I felt like there was something there. And sometimes it became something and sometimes it didn't. But it was also pretty clear that I was at the time I was the only one talking to them. And that changed after some time too. But no one within my company was reaching out to these young people or just was in the orbit of those young people. And so it kind of really gave me a niche and a way in. And I developed this sort of list of people who had come up online.
Oh wow, that's very cool. And then how does that transition into tech happen?
Over many years,
Yeah.
a long time.
Yeah.
Um, but a lot of those people who I represented were a lot of nonfiction journalists, people who were founders. Again, at the time, this is people like, Elizabeth Spires when she founded Gawker. It was Jeff Jarvis. It was Kevin Roos when he was a 19-year-old, still in college, way before his New York Times stint. It was Brian Stelter when he was still doing TV Newser. And just the people in that world and in that orbit. And what I sort of saw a couple of things. One is that for some of them the book is very obvious, but for others it's not. And it's like, this may be a really, really talented person, but a book is not the thing they're going to be doing now, or is not the like next obvious thing on their plate. So it was sort of like how I felt like I might have identified them, but not for the right format, let's say. That was
Interesting.
that was one aspect. And then another is that like just being exposed to that world um just made me really itchy. That's like the only way I can describe it. I was itchy. Please know I am not a founder myself. I have only nothing but respect for founders, but founding a company is one of the hardest things to do in the world. So it wasn't that I was like, I want to found a company. It was just that that felt like the future and the next wave. And book publishing, um, which has endured and has endured, and I believe will continue to endure, but is sort of a business where the sky is always falling. I sort of felt like the next decades were not necessarily just gonna sustain me for I couldn't imagine the career beyond, the next couple of years, and so, I really wanted to make the leap into tech. It was kind of not much more planned than that, but just knew that I wanted to get into that world.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um, Do you think how do you think publishing has changed since then? Because a lot has happened, and I feel like almost this new crop of, well, I shouldn't say new anymore. Like I think you see a lot of Substackers now getting into trad publishing deals, right?
Yeah.
So there's almost this reversal happening. Just like TikTok starts going into deals with studios, like
Right,
movie
or
studios.
music, yeah, or
Yeah, yeah.
musicians. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's an interesting kind of reverse change also happening there. And I'm curious what do you make of that full circle moment for book publishing?
Well, I think there's always a full circle moment. I mean, I think it's never that like it's never sort of always just one way. It kind of it's always been sort of permeable where the worlds and the formats go back and forth. So, if 20 years ago it was, the initial round of bloggers, and now it's like Substacks writers are sort of the most recent version of that. And I think people write books for very specific reasons. And there's a wide variety of reasons different for everyone. It could be what they want to say is longer, than what they feel that they have the space to do. Maybe they have, something, a big body of research that they want to be putting out into the world in a significant way. Maybe they just want to be doing more of what they're doing online, but let's say they're like have a cooking Substack and they're like, "Yeah, I want to do a book of recipes that is a body of work." It's also, it's a way to reach different audiences, and it is still a sign of legitimacy. It is still like the doorstep having that book is still the sign of legitimacy. How things have changed, again, I've not been in the business in quite some time, but clearly there's been an enormous amount of consolidation. Um, Penguin and Random House merged a number of years ago. Those are the two biggest by market share publishers. And I think generally there are, at least from traditional publishers, fewer books being published still, fewer books being bought and published. Now that's also, there's still the entire rise of self-publishing, so it doesn't speak to that. But at least for the traditional side, I think there's just been a general wanting to place fewer bigger bets.
Cool. No, that's interesting. Um, okay, so coming back to your transition to tech, um, I wanted to talk about obviously WeWork and Medium, and then the big one, Stripe, which is kind of almost it kind of set the blueprint for what a tech company's editorial strategy should be like. Um, so I think we should definitely get into Stripe Press. But yeah, first let's talk about WeWork and Medium, and then kind of leading into Stripe.
So, do you wanna know how I got into it? What's the
Yeah,
sort
please.
of question?
Yeah.
Well, so I was at Medium before I was at WeWork. Medium, I was an agent. I was an agent for 10 years, and I ended up quitting or not renewing my last contract, and just after a long period of exploration and a lot of conversations, and just deciding that I needed to make a clean break and sort of figure out what's next. And through through connections and just people I'd met. I had met Josh Miller, who's the co-founder of the browser company, when he was maybe he had just dropped out of Princeton. And had co-founded a company with Hirsch, who is his co-founder at the browser company, called Branch, which was an earlier attempt at sort of threaded conversation, online. And, um, I I am honestly not entirely sure how I met him, but I was connected with him, and through him, Ev Williams, who's the co-founder of Twitter, was an investor in him. Through Josh, I met, um, one of their, uh advisors, who is one of the other main people at Twitter, named Jason Goldman. He was the Twitter's head of product. And apparently, once Medium launched, Ev let it be known that he was looking for someone in New York to liaise with writers and to be the sort of the first editorial hire. And Josh was like, "You should meet Kate." And so Josh Miller, introduced me to Jason, who introduced me to Ev, and that's how, once I talked to Ev and heard his vision for what Medium was, I was like, "This is absolutely." It just felt right in my wheelhouse. This is a way for
Yeah.
me to work with writers and to help them, get their writing out, tell their stories in a way that wasn't dependent on the traditional publishing industry.
Gotcha. And was the play essentially like bring in some emerging writers onto the platform, get them to move their audience there, kind of like I guess like reminiscent of Substack, and what they did initially, or probably are still doing. Was the play kind of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a little bit different because it was a different time and it was a very different media ecosystem. Um, but I think the idea was even maybe less. I don't even know if it was as fully formed as bring over your entire audience, because I don't think that's how people thought in those days, or people feeling like, oh, I have an owned audience of however many thousands. It was more just like having professional writers, or just writers who were real writers, use the platform and show the different ways it can be used. And so we did a ton of different experiments where, it was freelance writers contracting with them to do a series of pieces. It was, you know, someone doing a huge feature to see how what are the tools that we could build within Medium's interface to like make the most interesting kind of story. This was the days of, if you recall, the New York Times and Snowfall, and it was sort of this first big immersive, infinite scroll, big wide margins, full bleed images that the Times did, and it just became like everyone wanted to do Snowfall. And how can you do that kind
Gotcha.
of storytelling online? And so that was some of what we were doing. We were also, though, reaching out to, thinking about like what an influencer strategy could be, or was, reaching out to people who had a platform and who maybe had something to say and needed a place to say it. And that might sound kind of obvious now, but like not everyone at the time wanted to own their own website. They didn't want to spin it up. They didn't want to have a URL. They didn't want to have to, you know, even if it was easy with WordPress, or relatively easy, or Tumblr at the time, it wasn't that they necessarily wanted a permanent place online, but they still had things they wanted to say. And Medium wanted to be, at the time at least, Medium has been through many incarnations, but it was this place where anyone could say what they wanted to say, and ideally the best writing would rise to the top and the best writing would find an audience. And so that manifested in a bunch of different ways. That would have been everything from, we went to the White House and got President Obama to put the, um, text of, at the time, the Iran deal of 2015, which again is a long time ago, but like hosted that on Medium. That was something he wanted to have out in the public square. I also had a dear friend who had worked at, Amazon, and had some health issues there, and she essentially wrote her story of what happened when she was there. Again, she wasn't about to set up her own website, but she just was like, "I have a story to share," and, that story did incredibly well too. So, it
Hmm.
was a really fun time.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel like Medium really like pioneered like almost like it was like pre Substack, right? Like this idea of like anyone can write long form about their very specific experience, and there's an audience for that. And early Medium was so like beautiful, like in terms of like the writing on there. So So yeah, like I remember like enjoying like many essays on there. So yeah.
Oh, well, that's very meaningful. Thank you. I think the thing I do think that's what Medium I hope successfully did, which was kind of shocking at the time that like, oh, anyone could write their essay, their thoughts, and it's gonna look first of all, what you write, how you write it, what it is published in, is actually gonna look the same as the interface that President Obama publishes in, and it's gonna look as beautiful and potentially scandalously as legitimate as that.
Yeah, it's not a clunky WordPress
Yeah,
site, you know? Yeah, yeah, yeah,
and that
totally.
was pretty revolutionary at the time.
Totally.
And so that I think one of the other things that became really clear, which again is probably sort of earlier proto Substack, is like, what are the formats that kind of become native to the platform and become native to the technology? Because those are like those are essentially the ones who really become stars. You think of YouTube stars, you think of TikTok stars. These are people who've like figured out the technology and sort of natively made it their own. And I think again for the era in which I was at Medium, it may have been like the open letter. Like, it would just seem like everyone was writing an open letter, and they were really
Totally.
good, and they were really, really heartfelt, and, you may roll your eyes at them, but it was like people had a lot to say, and a lot of people read that.
I guess like Stripe was a interesting transition as well, right? So I had Sam Bauman on the podcast, who's the head of publishing now at Stripe, and he kind of like spoke about the story from his perspective. Obviously, he came in through Works in Progress, but you were there before that. So yeah, I'm curious if you can talk about like the inception of that, because I think it's one of those stories that very few people know, like the the backstory of. Like it's just like a tech company investing that kind of capital and taking editorial so seriously, is still rare. Like even today, even though Stripe Press is such a huge success, it's been a fantastic branding move for Stripe. But you still don't see that level of seriousness. Maybe Colossus and well, Meridian as well, Mercury. Um, but it's rare, so I'm just curious to get your take on, like, yeah, what led to Stripe Press, if you can shed some light on that.
Sure, and I by that question, I'm think you mean what led to the creation of Stripe Press is sort of
Yeah,
what you're saying,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I wasn't there at the very beginning, so I just wanna be clear about that.
Yeah.
Bree Wolfson, who has since moved on to many other interesting editorial and tech projects, was the one who did that, but pretty soon after, Bree had launched the press, she had moved on, and they were looking for a full-time publisher, and, it just felt like when I saw that job listing, I don't even know where I saw it, I just felt like, "Oh my gosh, does it how this is such a unique opportunity." Kind of it feels like as an opportunity, it feels like a unicorn. Like, "What? A book publisher and in a tech company," which, again, is sounds kind of counterintuitive. I think, I think
One question there, actually, was Stripe like already pretty prominent? Like, or like, did it feel like a big risk for you, career, like professionally, or did it feel like a no-brainer?
Great question. It felt like a no-brainer in the sense that Stripe as a company was already, I don't know, let's say 3,000 people, clearly had product market fit, among a developer audience, was sort of and maybe is a little bit still the case, but Stripe is the kind of company that, like, not everyone knows about it, but the ones who know about it love it, and it's like a real devotion, and obviously that audience has gotten bigger and bigger. In terms of the career risk, like, I didn't really think of it as a career risk, but it certainly was like, okay, there's not a ton of infrastructure for a book publisher. That is not what the whole business of Stripe is. The business of Stripe is payments and global commerce, and a book publisher is a very, very tiny piece of that. So I think the reason it came about, and again, I was not there for the founding, was that and I'm just speaking about Patrick and John sort of together, not necessarily as one or the other, but they had some books that they looked up to that were out of print and that they felt like were still really valuable and that ideas don't have or some ideas don't necessarily have the same kind of don't have an expiration date on them. It is still valuable to read. Richard Hamming's The Art and Science of Engineering, or um, uh, The Dream Machine, or these sort of early books that were out of print, and they wanted to bring them back. And they wanted to bring them back because they were deeply influenced by them, and it enabled them to do the kind of thing of embarking on entrepreneurship and starting this company. So that was one aspect of it. Um, the other aspect, or another aspect of it, I think, is that essentially Stripe's biggest mission, and I think what really is a thread through the entire company, is um, enabling entrepreneurship and enabling more online commerce and more people to participate in that global economy, and in the online economy. And how do you do that? Or how does one do that? Or how does one support that? By enabling the creation of more businesses. Well, how do more businesses get created? People need ideas. People need ideas, whether it's tactical knowledge about here's how you start a business, or here's how you scale a business from 10 to 10,000, or big idea knowledge about here's like a different way of thinking about economics, or here's how, a scientific system, was created. But those are what they would sort of call inputs into a, an output, which could be entrepreneurship. And look, maybe those businesses end up using Stripe, but the businesses that are created from it end up using Stripe, but that's not the point. The point is that it's kind of standing for ideas that they think are important, that should be out in the world, because they enable entrepreneurship, they enable creation, they enable human creativity. And that is something that both they and Stripe stand for.
Yeah, it's such a crazy, audacious bet, but it's so beautiful because it's so long term, you know? It's almost so, it's like extremely enduring. And yeah, I think what typically happens is like founders are like so caught up with, and like marketers, everyone's like kind of incentivized to do, to kind of solve their piece of the puzzle and to solve it quarter by quarter. So sometimes it's like you need that level of, like, you need buy-in from the very top. Like this had to come from the Collison brothers almost, you know. Otherwise it wouldn't have happened, right?
I agree with that 1,000%. I think that I think because it sprang from them and their authentic interest and intellectual appetites, I think that is what is sort of the basis of success for it. It did not come out of a marketing team or a marketing initiative where, the sort of, ownership is potentially unclear, or whatever it is. Like, it directly springs from that, and so there's an authenticity to it. Um and really, it's like it kind of becomes this rallying point for the whole company, where everyone feels really proud of these things. And um and and yeah, I mean, I have been asked so many times, like, if we wanted to do a Stripe press, how would we do it? And I would be like, well, you're not Patrick or Tom.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it really has to be like an authentic extension of yourself, right? um like, I wanted to ask you a question there. Like, what was the degree of autonomy and day-to-day tactical decisions that made this happen, you know?
Yeah, it's again, I can't speak for how it actually got started, but perpetuating it for sure. I should also say I worked there primarily during the pandemic, which is just like I consider maybe we all do, the pandemic is sort of its own moment in time.
True, true.
Was so and I'm incredibly grateful for the time I had there, particularly during the pandemic. Mm. Yeah, I think it was kind of a mixture of a ton of autonomy. There are ideas I'm interested in. Um are there people I want to talk to? Are there, just rabbit holes I want to go down? And then also, operationally, really, like, I had a budget and a P&L, and I had to be running and managing those things, and we had to meet deadlines. And there are many deadlines in the course of making a book, because there are many
Yeah.
stages it goes through. And I think what is something that I felt, I mean, since I left traditional publishing, literary agenting, is that, very understandably, the tech world will always be frustrated with how slowly the book business moves. Like, there are very long timelines and deadlines, and things like that. And I do think Stripe Press compressed the timelines in ways that, like, they felt like, they didn't need as much time to do XYZ, because this is not a traditional publisher who's, necessarily trying to get all the major trade press's attention. or to, the mainstream press's attention. It's a little bit different. I think Stripe as a publisher, again, at the time, I can't speak for how it is now, was very good at speaking more directly to its audience.
Gotcha. No, that's cool. Yeah, thanks for sharing. That was awesome. Like, I think this is the part of the Stripe Press story that not a lot of people know about. I think just the inner workings of how it happened. Everyone kind of universally accepts that it's cool, and it was, and you know, so. But yeah, like people don't know like what makes it or what made it tick, and so no, that's awesome.
Well, I'm only one very small piece of that puzzle, so please know, like, there are other people who can speak more authoritatively about its beginnings and certainly how it operates now, but I appreciate that.
Yeah, of course, of course. All right, switching gears a little bit to your current role at Every, your editor in chief. I've had the privilege of working with Dan and the Every team, and it's been awesome. I know, obviously, the company has gone through various iterations as well. So yeah, I'm just like curious to hear um how that transition also happened, like how you kind of joined Every, and yeah, like what about the Every mission excites you?
Yeah. So, um, Every is, and has evolved to be, the one subscription we think you need to stay at the edge of AI, and it's ideas, which is content, which is what I run, apps, which are the apps, the productivity and other apps that we manage, and then trainings, which is consulting and courses. That is the 2025 version of Every. That was not always the version of Every that existed. I got to know the Every team, Dan, who you mentioned, and Nathan, his co-founder, actually when I joined Stripe. I was looking for new sources of writers, knowing that writers that I was I wasn't necessarily going to be looking at writers who big publishers were looking at. I just think it was a different pool, and so I needed to find where is this pool of people who might be the kind of people who would be great straight press authors. And so I had met Nathan, I think back in my Medium days, and I'd reached out to him once he started Every, and I was just like, "Hey, I was really curious to learn about what you're doing." And I talked to him and Dan, and it was just, very interesting what they were doing. Had launched initially on Substack, um, as a sort of collective of business newsletters, um, and just stayed in touch with them, from time to time while I was at Stripe. And then when I left Stripe and really wanted to get back into early stage, working a little bit more directly with founders and, as projects that were a little bit more immediate than a book. I had reached out to Nathan and Ann, just said, "Hey, I'm going freelance. If you guys need any help." And so I met with them and initially just signed on as an advisor, just sort of serving as a sounding board, and had a number of different clients and projects at the time, um, and was always just very aware that, like, I loved spending time in the Every Discord. I really liked, like, the kind of questions they would put to me, and then at a certain point, they needed a little bit more help with freelance editing, and so I took that on, and then I was like, "Well, if I'm doing this, I think that there's an opportunity to do this," and, um every ha- our f- we in terms of our product strategy are very we had a very early product, or the earliest one is called Lex, which is an AI word processor that Nathan and Dan spun up, and they ended up being able to basically spin it out as a venture backed company. And Nathan went off to run that and to be the CEO of Lex, which is what he is now. And Dan needed another partner to kind of like what take every forward and what was going to be that iteration. And that's when I joined full time. So it was probably about a year and a half. It was about a year and a half just advising and freelancing with them that I then joined.
Cool, I love that. Yeah, like I think like every like the one thing that Every is doing really well right now is really like owning the moment, and really um the one thing that really stands out is just the storytelling abilities of everyone in the team, right? So it's not just the writers, but it's also the builders, the entrepreneurs and residents, who are really good at showcasing their thoughts and their ideas. So I think this is like a good kind of segue into like my question around like how storytelling has evolved, right? Like I think we all talk about like the importance of distribution and that like because building is easy now. It's been
Never
it's
been
been the
easier.
easiest it's ever. Yeah, exactly, right.
Yeah.
um so yeah, I'm just curious like to get your thoughts on how storytelling has evolved and what it looks like in 2025 and what it's going to look like in 2026, a month from now.
Well, um, I think it's, talking about also maybe about a particular kind of storytelling, which is like tech storytelling, where I think, what's been happening for quite some time is like the notion of essentially going direct and telling your own story. And there are a lot of other people who can speak much more eloquently about all the virtues of going direct. But I think, it very much used to be you raised a round of funding, you placed the article in TechCrunch, it announced, the writer wrote it up, it announced it, you got your sort of hit of publicity, and then you would go about building your company from there. And I think, that's really changed where people essentially are, founders and builders are sort of owning their own channels and means of distribution, and feeling like they can reach them more effectively than necessarily placing a piece somewhere, or you know the notion of sort of owned audience versus like earned media. I think they each have a place, but they're different places. You might want to have your own audience speaking directly, speaking authentically, basically saying, I am someone who has this experience, and that's very much what we publish at Every, whether it's our in-house builders or people who are not part of the company but whom we publish. They have been the founder, the operator, the investor, the person in that company who helped build that function. They're not a journalist reporting on that function. That's a very different thing. Um, and so people really want to reach an audience that wants to hear that directly. Now, if you are, you know, potentially maybe you want to be talking about your funding round because you're specifically wanting to reach an audience of finance executives and business people, then maybe it does make sense to go to the Wall Street Journal. But I don't think it replaces you're also having your own channels, or you're also having another conduit to speaking to your audience, because I think people now get their information from very different sources. Um, yeah.
For sure. But how do you stand out, right? Because I feel like there's this whole debate around like AI slop and there being like a flood of new content out there. So how do you kind of maintain like a very high quality of writing editorially, while also making sure that you're top of mind? I think like I know like every has like amazing writers and it takes writing seriously, it takes editorial seriously. But I think a lot of companies kind of struggle with um I think typically what happens is like you have a software company and then they have a marketing team, maybe then they have a
The
content
blog.
person and yeah,
Yeah.
a blog, right?
Right.
Whereas like every was a blog and like a media company first and then it kind of branched into software. So it's a very different journey. I'm sure that comes with its own challenges because like how do you like grow the software without alienating your reader base and so on? Like that's a question I want to get into as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, like, um I think we're in the age of the individual, right? And the age of the sort of individual voice. And we know we meaning all of us, we know we're being marketed to all the time. That's not in question anymore. So it's kind of like how, we're not expecting people to not do that, but like the manner in which they do that, I think has changed. Like reading what would have been a company blog is is maybe not always going to be the way to get your story out. That said, if you are the founder of a company and you start your own newsletter, that could be a great way to get your story out, because people want to connect to that person and not, companyx.com. Um, And I think that that has that, like, layer of immediacy to it. How how do we stand out otherwise? Like, it takes an enormous amount of work. Each of our pieces goes through 3 or 4 drafts, and if not more, and sometimes I wish we could do more and we just don't have time. We have layers of editing, we have guidelines for writers, and, we work really hard in how we package them with the headlines and how we mm, tease them when we have a paywall, and how do you tease that paywall and the article that how do you tease the article after the paywall? Like, all of those things are article by article.
I love that. Yeah, I mean, there's an art and science to this, and yeah, it's like it's crazy how many different ways there are to do this. Um, Yeah, no, that's cool. I wanted to talk about AI. Obviously, Every is known to be an AI first company. There, you all have written extensively about how AI is integrated in workflows. Um, as someone who's like running editorial, like I'm curious, like what are some things AI does really well. But actually, the more like interesting question is like, what are things that AI still can't do very well? Because I know y'all are like proactively experimenting with things, and I'm sure like some experiments are a great success, and some are like, okay, maybe it's not there yet.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I'm curious what that frontier looks like right now.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, we fully expect everyone we work with to be using AI, whether you're a writer, an editor, or whatever the case may be. I think one of the things that AI is really good at is pattern recognition and um, being able to detect patterns in large amounts of data. So I think one of the ways in which we use it is, okay, we have we sort of keep a we have various inputs for this, but one of them is a continually updated document of what does not work, what has not worked for, let's say, headlines, subheads, and the introductions of stories. Those are really, really important if you think about it. It's like the headline, it's the subject line in your inbox. It's going to be like that first paragraph, what is going to get you to keep reading. And so nailing those is really, really important. And we go through each one every week and sort of how it did and how it could have been done better. And we feed it actually into a Claude project that has all of our style guide, our 400-point style guide, and all of these other editorial guidelines that essentially can be used to evaluate drafts. And it is not a replacement for a human editor, but it is a companion to the human editor. And the point of that project, because it has our style guide, it has all of the things about what makes a successful every essay. It has all of this running document of like doesn't work in headlines and what does. It just means that if it's gonna flag things, I'm gonna run it, let's say I put a draft through it, it doesn't mean that you take everything it says as gospel at all, but it's not coming from nowhere. Like, this is trained on our stuff. This isn't a generic AI. So, what I like to say is, like, you don't have to accept everything it says, but you have to consider it because it is based on our work. It is based on what we have done and has been successful, and so you just have to engage with it and maybe say, "Okay, that's actually I don't like that suggestion or I don't think it's right." Okay, that's fine, but it's not generic. And so that's one way in which we use it. Hopefully to kind of have a sort of set of every editorial standards that is something we can enforce across a widely distributed team, both in place, location, time zones, and also just various levels of freelancer and staff writer and full time, just people at very different places. How do we keep a certain level of quality so that we're starting from here and then bring it to this, not starting from here and then bringing it to this?
No, I love that. Do you ever like worry that people talk about AI in terms of like okay, it's like it kind of flattens the writing a little bit and like yeah, kind of diminishes the quirks of an individual's voice that actually make good writing sometimes or make engaging writing. Is that like an active conversation y'all have as editors? And like are there any ways that y'all counteract? I mean, there's no question that AI does that, but there like a mechanism to counteract that and be like, okay, like, um,
Yes, we have a one of the tools in our quad project is evaluate this draft for AI tells, which is because now we know what AI tells
right?
are, and those
Yeah,
AI tells could have been actually human generated or they could have been AI generated, but,
totally.
whether it's an M dash or it's a correlative construction, it's not X, it's Y. We have now trained it to spot those things as well. I mean, look, what I say is, and I mean for this not to be a contradiction, but this is sort of a policy for all of our writers is like we expect you to use AI and you need to stand behind every word you've written. So how you do that, I'm not saying there is necessarily one way to do that, but it means like, okay, maybe there are aspects of it in which you really used AI, but you have read it and determined, yes, this is actually saying what I mean for it to say. And this is
Totally.
how I want to say it. And for sure, do I sometimes I mean, it's gotten to a point where sometimes I'll catch things and I'll be like, "This sounds like AI," and then it'll be like, "No, it's actually I wrote it. It's just now that like it knows me." And so, but yeah, we absolutely have that conversation all the time.
Yeah, no, that's cool. Yeah, I feel like there's this unhealthy obsession over like AI tells and like
Yeah,
the fact that it like ruined the M dash, it ruined like the not only that kind of
not X the
construction.
Y. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That kind of sucks. And sometimes like you just want to use an M dash or like say it that way, you know?
and you
But
should,
yeah,
you should.
yeah,
I mean, I tend to think for me where I see things that are very obviously more AI or yes, sometimes in the constructions of like actually, the not XLI or the M dash or the way sentences very short clipped sentences in a row. But I also think it can be if a piece of writing is coming across as like everything is sort of very much an absolute, like this is happening from one extreme to the other, and that's how the whole thing is and not having the nuance, that's when I tend to say, like, "Wait a minute, I actually don't know that this is the way that we would wanna be saying this."
hmm. No, for sure, for sure. Okay, all right, switching gears a bit. I usually ask my guests, what are some like common storytelling mistakes founders make? But I think I'm gonna switch the question up a little bit because I think a lot of founders want to be writers, like, and they do look up to Every as one of the gold standards for what like good writing online should look like. Like the question is like, what are some like storytelling mistakes or common storytelling mistakes that writers make? Um,
Sure, that writers of any stripe,
of
no
any
pun
stripe, yeah.
intended. Yeah, I mean, I think, and I think, again, some of this may sound obvious, but I think, like, you have to write from your direct experience, and I think, like, it has to be anchored in a direct experience, and whether it's a direct story or direct detail, um, even if you were trying to make a statement about a trend or something, like, it doesn't mean anything unless it's backed up by experience, and it needs to be real, and I can generally tell if someone's not quite telling the whole story, or I'm like, "Something doesn't quite add up here," and then I to them and I'm like, "Oh, you left that whole part out," and I find that. What's another thing? Jargon. I think in tech in general, jargon is easy. I mean, it's what people use in their day-to-day interactions, and it's just easy to fall back on. We really try hard not to use jargon. Definitely don't know that we're successful all the time, but differently from jargon, it's not quite the same, but like highly technical language, or we want to be talking about highly technical things in a way that a generally sophisticated reader who knows technology but is maybe not has not been an engineer him or herself can read. And so, one of my most common edits is what does this mean? What does this mean? It's not that I don't know what it means. Like I know what it means to refactor your code, but how are you going to write it? And in fact, just my what came back in my granola crunched, my most common phrase was, "What does this mean?" Which I thought was an interesting reflection. But I was like, "Yeah, it got me pretty well because that's pretty much what I'm always asking. Like, what are you trying to say? What do you mean?" Because that's what it should be understandable. Um, which again does not mean like dumbing it down. It's just that if you want to reach an audience that isn't just like talking to your, the 10 engineering friends, then you need to say it in a way that's going to be engaging.
Yeah, I think you're right in saying that like overall, like if you're not selling to your engineering friends, you're not selling to your founder friends, you're actually selling to just regular decision makers, middle management at like trad companies who, yeah, who want to know what you're talking about, like who want to get to, who want you to get to the point faster and not kind of yeah. No, that's cool. That's fascinating. Anything on the every front now that we're heading into 2026? I'm sure you guys are busy in strategy mode on the editorial side.
We
Um,
are, we are.
anything fun that's coming up? Like anything you want to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, definitely have to have started planning, have to be doing more planning. I would say just generally, we will have our year in every coming up that we will publish, which will kind of have a holistic picture of everything that's been happening at the company, which we think is exciting. And I think going forward into 2026, broadly speaking, what the every strategy is to like how to sort of knit together this ecosystem. So we have the ideas, we have the apps, we have the training. Even in the apps, there are four different ones. Like, how do we make them all feel like part of the same universe? And so when you're buying that subscription bundle, you're buying into, for every piece of that universe. And so I think that's what a lot of the work will be in 2026.
Cool, love that. All right, last question that I ask everyone. Any like books or podcasts or any resources that have influenced your approach to editorial today? Like one seminal book that you'd recommend?
Stephen King's On Writing is just
Classic,
like
yeah.
classic
Yeah.
writing simply, writing clearly, saying what you mean, not using adverbs, like all of those things I still think is something I
Yeah.
come back to all the time.
Yeah.
And it's an oldie but goodie.
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic for a reason, right? So, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Kate, this is really fun. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.